We're not through with Thoreau, and we haven't done a thorough job. So to get through, we have to more thoroughly get through Thoreau before I get thrown out. So, chapter 10, Wild Fruits, page 404 from the Life of Henry David Thoreau. This is called Wild Fruits. Now it's 1857 to 1859. We're getting towards the end, not exactly the end of the book though. At this point, let's see, Thoreau is just over 40 and is 40 and 40 to 42, and Emily Dickinson is like 27. Not that they ever meet. A state which bore this kind of fruit and suffered it to drop off as fast as it ripened would prepare the way for a still more perfect and glorious state from the civil disobedience. The last excursions to Cape Cod and to the Maine woods. Okay, this is his last trip to Cape Cod and the Maine woods. Quote, "It is time now to bring our philosophy out of doors." I think we should do this reading outdoors. It was June 1857, and as the softening air brought out the earth's song of the crickets, Thoreau longed for a good long walk. When Channing said he was game, Thoreau cleared his calendar, and when Channing backed out, he went anyways. Is that what I do when somebody backs out? I just go alone. Setting off on the bright Friday morning of June 12th for the broad, bleak sands of Cape Cod. In Plymouth, Marston and Mary Watson brought him along on a Sunday sail to Clark's Island to investigate lobster pots and grackle nets with Uncle Ned. Monday morning, after a visit with James Spooner at his farm amid the woods, the Watsons drove Henry to Monomet, and with a twinge watched him shoulder his knapsack and head down the beach alone. How do you go for an extremely long walk alone? For the next week, Thoreau followed the bay shore, turned east to cross the peninsula to the Outer Banks, then trekked north to Provincetown, a good 80 miles, navigating by map and compass. By the time he hit the Outer Banks, the wind and drizzly fog had soaked him through and plastered his legs with a carapace of sand. After shivering in a cold, quote, human house, unquote, for a spell, he walked on to visit John Newcomb, the well-fed oyster man. He wrote a whole essay on well-fed oyster man, until a neighbor told him Newcomb died the previous winter, 95 years old. That's a good lifespan. Does that show that Cape Cod's a good place to live? It must have been a strange conversation. Thoreau had just found a dead storm petrel, which with perfect Thoreauvian logic he tied to his umbrella to measure once he found shelter. Quote, "They may have taken me for a crazy man," unquote, he admitted. That afternoon he reached the Highland lighthouse for 3 delicious days of rambling over the dunes. visiting the new telegraph office station and chatting with the lighthouse keeper, the neighbors, and the carpenters repairing the lighthouse. One of them remarked that the Cape Ann beach had no equal for grandeur. Thoreau took note. Sunday, he headed to Provincetown, drinking in the dunes solitude like medicine. Quote, sweet to me as a flower. Do you want to go to Cape Cod? After a night in the Pilgrim's house. What? After a night in the Pilgrim's house, scratching at bedbugs while listening to feral cats, he boarded the steamer to Boston on June 22nd and made it home in time for supper. Remember, Concord isn't far from Boston. It had been a good trip, restful and invigorating. Thoreau took more than 50 pages of notes. See, he has pretty easy access to Cape Cod by ferry from Boston. Better access than we have. Because they were more advanced back then in technology, and we've fallen behind. It had been a good trip, restful and invigorating. Thoreau took more than 50 pages of notes, almost none of which made it into Cape Cod. Though he tinkered with the book's final chapter. He wrote a book, you see. For the most part, the manuscript had tucked in its corners and declared itself finished. So he let others' projects claim his attention, not till June 1865. Nearly 3 years after his death, so that means he died in 62 or so. Would Cape Cod be published? Interestingly, his long alienated Catholic friend, Isaac Heckler, gave one of its strongest reviews, acknowledging Thoreau's, quote, deep religious feeling despite his skepticism towards all organized religions. Had he lived in the 5th century, he would have been a father of the desert. He would have been a desert father, like a contemplative. You think the desert fathers are the best, almost. Heckler catches something of the strangeness of Cape Cod. Walden's dark twin. The strangeness. Into the one, Thoreau confessed all the metaphysical terrors that the other would allay. He never altered the narrative structure given him by chance on his first trip there. The long, tedious approach by stagecoach, the astonishments of the beach, strangely disorientating, populated with anomalous creatures shaped by the rough chaos of the littoral zone, the mordaunt hilarity of the well-fleet oysterman, the earnest labors of the lighthouse keeper, keeping his lamps trimmed and burning to the last, the searching inquiry into history, until the shifting sands of the Cape and the shifting forces of time nibble at the foundation of all certainties. This is dark work. We're reading on a dark day. Most important of all, Thoreau kept his narrative embedded in his shocking opening, the Gaulish shipwreck. That's a shocking opening. The ghoulish shipwright of the St. John wrecked through the unspeakable pain of Fire Island. He did not dispel the existential darkness of this opening, but held it in view right through the cosmic wreck of humanity. I wonder if humanity is wrecking the earth currently. In the locked up, quote, human house, to the bitterness of, quote, naked nature, turning the carcasses of men and beasts alike in their beds, tucking fresh sand under them, quote, inhumanly serene, sincere. Cape Cod is a work of late-century naturalism, as dark as anything by Stephen Crane. Quote, the annals of this voracious speech, who could write them unless it was a shipwrecked sailor? Like Crane, Thoreau leavened his nightmare with touches of weird beauty. But unlike Crane, he relished it with a visceral joy, making this book of darkness blaze with light. Cape Cod was Thoreau's own Highland lighthouse, beaming through the edge of chaos across, quote, the spring of springs, the waterfall of waterfalls, a beacon to reach all humanity at sea. Quote, a man may stand there, he ended, quote, and put all America behind him. Is that the prima vera vocation for America? It's the ultimate starting point. Ready for more. On July 11th, Thoreau wrote George Thatcher that he was again strong again, unquote, bent on making a leisurely and economical excursion, unquote, by canoe with perhaps 2 companions, say, up Moosehead Lake to the Elgash River, and beyond to French Canada, some hundreds of miles, a good month's trip. Would his son George, who had grown up on these waters, be willing to come along? Here he's looking for a young man to help. I guess I need some young men to go kayaking with, canoeing, all across Maine. When George declined, Thoreau decided to hire an Indian guide instead. He wrote Eben Lomas, too. Would he care to join a party of 3 on a leisurely trip? Lomas came to visit, and they boated the Assabet together, where at the outflow from the Barrett sawmill, Thoreau lit the methane fumes belched from the sawdust shoals with a match, and they heard it flash. But no, Lomas could not go either. Who's going to go to Boundary Waters, Minnesota, and canoe? Next on his list was Edward Hoar, who long ago had been his partner in setting Walden woods ablaze, and who, wow, that's when he, way back, and who had just returned to Concord. Ed's wanderlust had taken him to California to practice law and pan for gold, then to Peru. This guy's a real, where he learned of his father's death. Back home to help his family, the prodigal son was proving a thoughtful man and skilled naturalist who respected Thoreau's way of doing things. Years later, Hoar, H-O-A-R, Hoar, talking about Edward, recalled what that meant, quote, to walk long and far, to have wet feet, and go so for hours, to pull a boat all day, to come home late at night after many miles. If you flinched at anything, he had no more use for you, unquote. Thoreau knew few of his friends were rugged enough to be true wayfaring outdoorsmen. You gotta be rugged. I guess if you read this, it could make you rugged. Blake, though he longed to go, was not, but the quiet, capable Ed Hoar was. So he's going back to Maine, dear. They set off for Bangor on Monday, July 20th, 1857. The cars to Portland were hot and cindery, but Maine was spring-like, cool and fresh, and the steamer into Bangor was delayed by fog. By early afternoon, they reached the Thatcher's house. The locals warned Thoreau not to hire an Indian guide, insisting they were dirty, obstinate, prone to drunkenness, and hard to understand. The locals warned Thoreau against hiring an Indian. They said that they were dirty, obstinate. Okay. But Thoreau was bent on having an Indian at any rate. So next morning, he liked to learn Indian language. So next morning, the cousins drove to Old Town and ferried over to Indian Island, where they found the village almost deserted. Whoever wasn't off hunting, gathering shellfish, or canoeing the waterways of New England, selling baskets, had evacuated to other Indian settlements in fear of smallpox, which had broken out in Old Town. Thatcher and Thoreau walked up to the first person they saw, a sturdy man dressing a deerskin in the yard of his solid two-story frame house and amid a garden and fruit trees. Here, dear, where the chapter is called Wild Fruits and Fruit Trees. It turned out to be Joe Polis, whom Thatcher greeted as an old friend. They'd grown up together, and the Polis brothers had been Thatcher's guide the year before. Would Polis like to take them up to the Allagash in question? Quote, yes, me want to get some moose, unquote, he answered, still scraping the deerskin. Thatcher bargained Polis down from $2 to $1.50 a day. Thoreau had a very limited budget, and they shook on it until he's getting $1.50 a day. He's a Indian guide. What is going to do? Take him up as a guide up to the Allagash River and up into Maine. Thoreau wanted an Indian guide. Well, because they have a kind of knowledge that he wants to gain and get some insight that a white man wouldn't get. White man. Do you think white men, the world belongs to old white men? $1.50 a day, I mean, you might make $1 a day, typically, so he's making $1.50. They were lucky, retorted Thoreau. Polis was known to be, quote, a particularly steady and reliable man. Just how very lucky time would reveal. Thanks to Polis, who could have been another boy's adventure, would be like an adult's exploration, a mutual encounter along a vexed cultural frontier. Polis was a tribal leader, equally at home in New York and Philadelphia as in the deep woods. He had represented his people before the governments of Maine and the United States and helped secure the Penobscot. Penobscot is an Indian tribe, a permanent place in the white world, whose own leaders had leveraged away nearly all of the Penobscot's immense lands. By treaty, they retained possession of Indian Island, one of their ancestral homes. So they got a little bit left. You know, you can visit Indian reservations even now. It was funny out by the Glacier National Park. They had a whole area. There's a lot of Indian reservations. From the small but protected sovereign base, the Penobscot people were fighting to establish their niche in a rapidly modernizing economy, expanding their traditional gardens into market farms, their subsistence hunting into commercial economy, their crafts and technologies above all basketry and birch bark canoes into products. They themselves market across commercial networks extending into the northeast urban centers. Would you like a birch bark canoe? You don't want one? That'd be kind of cool to have one. I hate canoes. Thoreau had some awareness of this, for he habitually struck up conversations with the Penobscot camped along the Concord River or on the river banks near Harvard. Edward Hoar knew this too, for he recalled from childhood how the Penobscot Indians would canoe down the coast from Maine into the surf, carry their boats around Lowell, and continue up the Concord River, where they would put up their cone-shaped bark shelters and sell those fragrant baskets they made. Do you like Indian baskets? But Thoreau did not realize the Penobscot were fighting for cultural sovereignty as well. On this front, too, Polis was a leader, honored by his people as a Mitoruan, a teacher and shaman. See, he's a high-ranking guy, and he's just taken this $1.50 job. As a guide for white adventurers, Polis was responsible for educating white society about the Penobscot world. Saying yes to Thatcher meant taking Thoreau in hand. Perhaps he could teach this New England villager a thing or two about the Penobscot way of life in their ancestral lands. The process began that evening when Polis and his birch bark canoe, which he had made himself, arrived at the Bangor train station. Thoreau led him up to the Thatchers, chattering all the way in his eagerness to break the ice. Polis, who was carrying a 100-pound canoe over his head, and who, as Thoreau editorialized, quote, above all was an Indian, puffed along, only grunting once or twice. Here's an example of grunting when you have to lift a 100-pound canoe and talk to Thoreau. Would that lead to grunting? As he would later exclaim to Ed Hoar, why do you keep asking pointless questions? Maybe your way of talking may be all right, no Indian way. The Indians don't ask so many questions. But he should charge extra for all of those questions. The next morning, Polis studied how to pack his 2 guests and their mountain gear into his small canoe. Goodness, they got to get all their gear and 3 guys in a canoe. Then they boarded the stage together, lashing the canoe securely on top. Thoreau marveled that Polis himself carried nothing but the clothes he wore, a blanket, an axe, and a gun, all he needed. See, he's a light packer. He took his clothes, a blanket, an axe, and a gun. These Indians are like minimalist in a way. We're studying minimalism. The stagecoach was crowded, the weather stormy, and all the way to Moosehead Lake. Polis sat stolid and wordless, even when the gibes of one rude passenger made his eyes, quote, glisten a little. The light began to dawn on Thoreau when a, quote, a tipsy Canadian, quote unquote, asked Polis, quote, you smoke? Yes, would you lend me your pipe a little while? Me got no pipe, said Polis, with his trademark, quote, far horizon, unquote, stare. But you do, thought Thoreau, who that very morning had watched Polis carefully pocket his pipe and a good supply of tobacco. See, I thought he didn't, it said there that he didn't bring more than a blanket, axe, and gun, but he brought his tobacco. Well, that's a small item, I guess. The raging storm squashed their plans to start that day. Instead, they pushed past the crowds to an inn near the shore. Early next morning, they stepped gingerly into the canoe under Polis's watchful eye, lest they tip it or put a foot through the bottom. Interesting now, with a birch bark canoe, you better watch your step so you don't put your foot through the bottom. And launched into the cloudy dawn twilight as they paddled towards Mount Kineo. Kineo is Kineo. Thoreau soaked up the scenery and watched Polis narrowly. I'd like to go to school with you, he ventured, and learn your language. How long would it take? A week, Polis answered. Plenty of time. Thoreau started writing down all the names Polis gave them for ducks, songbirds, loons, and the places as well. He was pleased. Polis knew the meaning of Mesquitequad, or Mesquitecook, as Polis preferred. It proved that Massachusetts and Maine were 2 poles of one world, linked by the Indian. Encouraged, Polis mounted to Mount Kineo. Encouraged, Polis pointed to Mount Kineo and related his people's tradition that it was a great moose killed by a mighty hunter, whose name Thoreau ignored, dismissing the tale as Indian superstition, related with long-winded, quote, dumb wonder. This was a serious mistake. You think it's a mistake to ignore the name of the Indian god? This was a serious mistake. Polis had offered one of his people's deepest creation stories, central to their cosmography, while Thoreau could readily see the poetic and symbolic dimensions of, say, the artist of Thoreau. He was utterly deaf to Polis when he spoke in the same mythic register, showing the distance. Thoreau had yet to travel in shedding 19th century stereotypes. That's surprising. Even Thoreau is missing it. Unfortunately, Thoreau's ridicule was instructive to Polis, who recalibrated accordingly. From then on, Polis offered no more cosmologies, only names and histories. Thoreau never realized what his rudeness cost him. That afternoon, the crowd camped at the base of Mount Canoe, where Polis showed Thoreau and Hoar how to build a fire in the driving rain with wet wood. Wow. Dear, how do you build a fire in driving rain with wet wood? This is like a lesson for Boy Scouts, I guess. While Polis fished, Thoreau and Hoar climbed the mountain, looking down on the buildings and grounds of the Canoe House Hotel far below. The mountain was made, Thoreau discovered, to his delight, of the same unique horned stone as the arrowheads he was forever pocketing in Concord. There, under his feet, was the very rock, the source and raw material of Tahatawan arrowhead. It was yet another link in the widening network that bound his Walden world to the Penobscot world of Joe Polis, and a hint had he listened to the deeper meaning of Polis's Canoe story. That night, as they sat around the campfire looking into the dusty woods, Polis told him of his hay and potato farming, and pressed Hoar, the lawyer, with questions about white property law. He also identified a snake by its call. Wow. A snake by its call. Thoreau was startled to learn that snakes had calls. But there it was, and sang them to sleep with songs he learned in childhood from Jesuit priest. Not the snake, but Joe Polis. The snake didn't learn songs from Jesuit priest. The pages of the Jesuit Relations, which Thoreau had been reading for years, were coming alive. The Indians had contact with Jesuits. So was the wood itself. Around midnight, Thoreau awoke to stoke the burning fire and found something that moved him profoundly. The unburned end of a stick of firewood was glowing not hot with flame, but cold and brilliant white. Years later, Orr remembered how Thoreau shook him awake to show him the cold, white coals of wild wood burning in his palm, lighting up his hands like fire. This was Artosoka, Artoosoku, explained Polis. And his people had seen fires like this passing by, as high as the trees, making a noise. This time Thoreau was prepared to believe him. Polis's people had been abroad in nature at all times, in all seasons, and quote, nature must have made 1,000 revelations to them which she still keeps secret to us. Here he wanted no science but sheer wonder. Suddenly the woods was, quote, not an empty chamber, in which chemistry was left to work alone, but an inhabited house, and for a few moments he enjoyed fellowship with them. Now Polis had his full attention. Early the next morning, as they paddled to reach the northeast carry before the wind rose, Thoreau questioned him hard. How do you find your way in the woods? The more he asked, the vaguer Polis' replies became. To Polis, the real puzzle was how Thoreau, of any white man, could fail to know such things. That finding in the deep woods was simply too obvious to put into words. As a guide, Polis knew how easily white men got themselves turned around and hopelessly lost, and every time, laughing, he would lead them straight back to camp. There's a thing of finding the art of finding your way, the lost art of finding your way, is a book. But how do you do that? Pressed Thoreau. Quote, oh, I can't tell you, great difference between me and white man. You could read the signs of the trees and the wind and the stars, and who knows. White men don't know. You can't be a white man. At the Penobscot River end of the northeast carry, they found a group of St. Francis River Abenaki camped where Thoreau had lain awake 4 years before, listening as another group regaled one another with stories of which he had understood not a word. Canoes, though, he did understand, and since they were building one, he stopped by for another lesson story to think the art of making birch bark canoes would someday be lost. At last he could record it, perhaps learn enough to build one himself. That night they camped early to beat another storm, cursing the mosquitoes hatching in the wet woods. That day Thoreau was anxious to move on. Not so fast, objected Polis. How can you not honor the Sabbath? They compromised, perhaps encouraged by the mosquitoes, on a short day's work, paddling to a nearby camp on the river junction above. They had to get away from those mosquitoes. Polis knew the place well, just how well Thoreau began to realize when he saw Polis's blaze on a tree, a bear paddling a canoe as his blaze, with his name said Polis, we alone, Joseph Polis, and the dates he had been there, as Polis added a new date, July 26, 1857. Thoreau realized, quote, this was one of his homes. In fact, every square rod of this alleged wilderness was his home. The lessons continued. Polis showed him how to tell black spruce from white, and how to dig up spruce roots, strip their bark and split them into a tough, flexible string for lashing canoes together. He made it look easy, but Thoreau found it impossible to imitate. When Polis showed them how to make a different herbal tea for every day of the week, using plants Within easy reach, Thoreau's head began to spin. Tell me all you know, he begged, or I'll tell you, and I'll tell you all I know. Polis agreed. The teaching would continue. But continuing with Thoreau, we're not through. As the conquered man learned the next day, it wouldn't be quite that easy. Reaching the Allagash Lakes meant crossing Mud Pond Carry, then canoeing to Chamberlain Lake. Mud Pond was the wettest carry in Maine, and that summer was the wettest in years. The conquered men took a deep breath as Polis gave them careful instructions before setting off with the canoe. They gathered up their own loads. Thoreau calculated his pack weighed 60 pounds. While Hoar divided his to make 2 trips and set off in Polis's footsteps, but they could not make out Polis's tracks on the mossy forest floor. After 2 miles, Thoreau knew they were lost. They got lost. But a sign ahead pointed to Chamberlain Lake. How hard could it be? They pushed on. Soon they were sinking into mud up to their knees. Now we're really stuck. Thoreau dropped his pack into the tussock and waited while Hoar backtracked for his second load. After a very long time, Hoar returned with his load and a very surprised Polis who could not comprehend how they could possibly have gotten themselves into the tote road to Chamberlain Lake, twice the distance, instead of the carry path to Mud Pond, which his own footsteps had made perfectly obvious. He evidently thought little of our woodcraft, observed Thoreau in chagrin. But it was too far to turn back. On they went, while Polis returned to move the canoe and the rest of the gear on up to Chamberlain Lake. My goodness. It got worse. I don't know if I'm going to go on this canoe trip. Thoreau and Hoar slogged themselves into a second swamp. This one clotted on all sides by dead and fallen trees, high as their heads, trees killed when Chamberlain Lake had been dammed a few years before, reversing the flow of the Allagash to carry commercial log traffic south of Bangor. The 2 men scrambled miserably from pool to pool, over tree after tree, as the sun sank behind them. To make it still worse, Hoar's boots, which unlike Thoreau's thinner shoes held in the water, had rubbed his feet raw. Every step was torture, and Laura was reaching the outermost limit of physical exhaustion. Darkness was falling, and they were growing desperate until once again Polis reappeared and led them to the lake shore. Too exhausted to pitch their tent, they ate a late supper and stretched out on the stones for the night. As they stared up at the night sky, Polis named the stars for Thoreau, and a loon called from far over the lake, the very voice of the wilderness. Thought Thoreau, brutal as the day had been, quote, he would not have missed that walk for a good deal. It's some wild walk. They began the next day washing up in the lake before paddling across to the outlet of the Allagash River. Polis, paddling at the stern, had 2 prod poor Hoar, who kept threatening to tip the canoe by falling asleep. They portaged over a pair of dams to Eagle Lake, part of the Allagash itself, and landed on Heron Island. There they munched an early dinner while they waited the options. Originally, Thoreau had planned to continue north from this point on into French Canada and back by way of the St. John River. This was perfectly feasible, said Polis. As they pointed to the various camps they would use, he knew the way well. It was easier than going around on the rugged Penobscot, which was full of dangerous rapids. But which way was wilder? Asked Thoreau. Wilder. Penobscot, replied Polis. The Canadian route took them through well-settled country. In this land, north cannot mean wild. That settled it. Heron Island, almost 110 miles from Bangor, marked their northernmost point. From there they turned south and east, following the lumberers' road that every spring carried Maine's trees downriver to Bangor's sawmills. It was faster too. That meant there would be time for a side trip to the summit of Mount Katahdin, which beckoned in the distance. Page 413. We're reading about the wild fruits and Thoreau's trip up long trip up into Maine with the Indian guide. We're talking about canoe trip.